Thanks, everybody, and welcome to the July 2021 edition of the Cerini Nonprofit Connection. As I said, that even though this is a nonprofit thing, I think it affects everyone, so we've opened it up to the whole world. Everybody wants to create a safe workplace for their employees. While most New Yorkers have been vaccinated, others feel strongly about not getting the vaccine. As a result, employers have had to develop vaccination policies. Today, we have with us two experts, Susan Kreeger and Doug Rowe, who'll be kind of walking us through and answering some questions. Susan Kreeger is from RealHR Solutions, and Doug Rowe is a partner in Certilman Balin, Hyman, and Adler's employment law practice. So hopefully they can shed some light on this important topic. So Susan and Doug, thanks and welcome.
Thank you, Ken.
Thank you, Ken.
Okay, so let's just kind of get started. And if anybody does have questions, please just ask those questions through the Q&A, and I'll try to get to as many of them as humanly possible. But again, I think we have a lot more questions than we have time here. So many employers are grappling with their vaccination policies. Should they mandate vaccination or not? What would an employer set? Why would an employer, I should say, set a policy for vaccination? So Susan, you want to start with that?
Sure. And I think initially we just need to acknowledge that Delta variant has changed the landscape with a lot of our discussion today around how we might think about these issues. But I think it's also important, and Doug will certainly talk about this more, and he mentioned as we were talking before starting the webinar, a lot of the legal issues really are still the same. So it'll make for, I think, an interesting conversation, taking that into consideration. So I think a lot of, again, back to Delta, a lot of companies now are rethinking what their policy should be. I think one of the main things happening with the rates of transmission going up with Delta, companies are rethinking reopening. They're rethinking whether they should mandate. I think there's a little bit more willingness to mandate on the part of large companies. I mean, every morning you look at your news feeds and more companies are announcing they're doing some version of mandating vaccines. I think, and the bottom line is companies are looking for ways to create safe and healthy workplaces for their employees. How do they do that? There's a lot of emotion around vaccination. There's a lot of concern around the idea of mandating vaccinations, and there are health concerns on both sides. So there's so much to take into account. But the bottom line is employers want to create a safe and healthy work environment. So there are some specific things that we need to think about and consider in connection with that. If you have a vaccination mandate, how do you police that? Who gets the information? How do you account for people who need to be accommodated for health reasons? There are all of these different considerations that should go into a policy that you want to create. One of the things that I do hear a lot from my clients, how do you reduce the anxiety that people have for bringing people back into the workplace if that's what you're going to do? Mass vaccination mandates could help that. As we know, there's another side to that story as well, but that's another big reason that we're hearing about why others want to see or know everyone in their workplace has been vaccinated. You avoid, for a vaccination policy, you avoid the need for implementing quarantine periods. If somebody is affected by COVID or has come into contact, you avoid the need for contact tracing. You avoid having to treat different classes of employees differently. So these are all reasons that I see with clients and also read about for reasons for having mandating vaccinations in the workplace.
Doug, you want to add to that?
Sure. So why an employer would want to have a mandatory vaccination program is pretty clear and simple. They want to protect their employees. First of all, they have an obligation to protect their employees under the law. And you know, if you say what law, OSHA requires employers under the General Duty Clause. OSHA is the Occupational Safety and Health Administration. Requires employers to provide a safe workplace for their employees. So it's easy to say that an employer should mandate vaccinations for that reason. Employers also want to protect their company. If they have an outbreak in the workplace, they're going to have a scenario where they're going to lose production, they're going to lose money, they're trying to protect their business. So, you know, there's obvious reasons to protect the employees and to protect the business is a reason to have a mandatory vaccination program. You know, this issue obviously is a very hot topic, and it's become even hotter because of the Delta variant. And as I said before, and as you mentioned, Ken, this issue is not new, the issue of mandatory vaccinations. It actually arose in December of 2020 when the EEOC, the U.S. Equal Employment Opportunity Commission, first came out with regulations basically indicating that employers can mandate vaccination. So that gave employers the green light. And many employers have done it, and there have been many issues arising out of it since then. But some employers mandated it, some didn't, and we went on, and that's how business was operating over the past 4, 5, 6 months. In the meantime, the Delta variant has now hit and has caused a resurgence of employers addressing this issue. And this is like such a hot topic that just since yesterday, I'm just going to read some of the headlines. And this all came from yesterday and this morning. Google postpones return to office and makes vaccination mandatory. Durst employees in New York City, still unvaccinated after Labor Day, will be fired. The Related Companies, a large real estate development company in New York City, online job postings say that anyone working on site must be vaccinated as a condition of employment. Morgan Stanley, proof of vaccination required to enter buildings. Governor Cuomo this week announced that all state employees are to get vaccinated by September 6th or take weekly tests if they're not vaccinated. Also, Mayor de Blasio issued the same mandate, but the New York City employee requirement is by September 13th. Netflix became the first major studio to require COVID vaccinations on all US productions. Just this morning, about an hour ago, Twitter announced that they're shutting down their New York City office again, due directly to the Delta variant spike. Federal buildings. Nancy Pelosi announced that all visitors to the Capitol building had to be vaccinated. Well, it was also announced this morning that the Capitol Police will arrest staffers and visitors who refuse the mask mandate in the Capitol building. It's that severe, and as I indicated before, it makes sense. But you know, the Delta variant, I think, has also given employers the opportunity to again educate employees on the importance of the vaccination, again for their own health and safety, and for the benefit of the employer itself. So I think that employers need to focus on, it was always an issue as to whether to mandate vaccinations, and if employers were to mandate vaccinations, how to convince employees to buy into the policy. And again, this is a renewed opportunity to educate employees on the importance of becoming vaccinated.
So, I mean, this opens up a whole bunch of questions here in terms of what you guys have said. First one I'll throw out is, you have individuals who have been vaccinated who have come down with COVID. And I know, Susan, you said that, if you're vaccinated, that avoids contact tracing and everything else. We talked about masks. I mean, how does this now start to change some of those policies where, you do have, individuals who have been vaccinated who are coming down with it, with the COVID virus? How do you deal with all of this in terms of modification of policies and standards?
I think, and I hate to say this, I think we're going back a little bit. And there are some things that had been in place around, around masking and around what I just said earlier, the vaccination can avoid some of the contact tracing requirements. I think, we're in a place where we don't have enough people vaccinated to make some of this all go away. So we're going to have to stay flexible, and we're going to have to pay attention to, in certain areas, there are certain areas where there's a lot more transmission. There might be requirements that are different there than are in other locations. Some things that I've just been reading recently, we need to maybe more fine tune how we apply some of the requirements around contact tracing, how we require masking going forward, where we require it. I think it's just a moving target, and it has to stay flexible. And I think people are asking, and the question you ask kind of leads me to think about, people are saying, why at this point, why am I getting vaccinated? Sort of what is the benefit? I mean, certainly you're going to stay healthier. You're going to stay healthy. You're going to avoid the transmission, the widespread transmission. And this goes to Doug's comment about education. I think that is a critical part of any policy. Policies will be put in place, but people need to be educated around why. They need to feel comfortable and understand why they're being asked to do certain things. And it's just changing by the minute.
Doug, you had mentioned somewhere along the line in one of your responses, something about the need for regular testing. So if people aren't going to be vaccinated, they have to be regularly tested. I think that was one of the standards on the headlines that you were going through. How does that regular testing work? How regular is that testing? Do you see out there? And who's responsible for it? Is the employer responsible for paying for it, or paying staff to go and get that regular testing on the employer's time, or is that on the employee's time?
Keep going, Ken, because there are so many questions surrounding testing as an alternative to mandatory vaccination. So, again, some employers will have a mandatory vaccination policy, and if so, they'll have to still deal with potential objections based upon disability or religious objections. But if, as an alternative to employees who refuse to become vaccinated, if they want to have a regular testing requirement, they can do so. But you've raised the issues. So who's responsible for paying for that? Is it covered by the health insurance policy that the company may have and provide? If an employee has to take time off to get tested, is that compensable time? By the way, all these issues have not gone through the court system yet. I can't necessarily tell you, but I would think that an argument can be made that if an employer has a mandatory testing requirement, one of the options is to bring in a medical provider on a weekly basis to have that testing. And again, as you said, who pays for that? Does the employer pay for that? And it's not inexpensive to have somebody come in on a weekly basis and run these tests, or does the employee pay for it? And if the employee pays for it, then does that create potentially a violation of the wage and hour laws? And if an employee is only a minimum wage worker and ends up having to pay for testing, does that create a minimum wage violation because it's an expense that's incurred by the employee in furtherance of the employment, which results over the course of that week in a scenario where the employee is actually paid less than the minimum wage because of that expense that the employee was forced to incur. So again, these are the issues. They have not been resolved. Arguments could be made on both sides. And, again, I haven't seen many companies with that mandatory policy. And again, I mentioned it that, that's what Governor Cuomo it required. And again, public employment may be different than a private sector employment, but these issues have not been resolved, have not gone through the courts yet.
Doug,
Yeah.
oh, sorry, go ahead, Susan.
Sure.
If I could just jump in on that. That does raise so many unanswered questions, but critical questions for employers around the idea of ongoing testing. And we've been hearing that in a number of places, whether it's government, private organizations, if you're not vaccinated, you have to be tested weekly. And what will that look like? How will that play out? Where are people going to go to are they going to have to get tested on their own time or on company time? Like Doug was saying, who pays for it? There are issues around incentivizing also. If you try to incentivize people to get vaccinated, you're impacted if you bring in someone to do the testing or to do the vaccinations. There's an impact on how much you can incentivize under other laws that have to do with wellness. So there are just multiple questions that that come up all the time. But the fact of the matter is, as a company, you need to make decisions and you need to decide how you're going to handle these things. And so thinking it through, using the best information we have at this point, knowing there's going to be a certain amount of risk because these things have not worked their way through the courts. It's a tough position for employers, but that's a lot of what we do. We have to help our employers make those decisions. And it's not a cookie cutter approach at all. It really depends on the kind of work you do, the setup you have. We have a client out in rural Montana that has very different needs than our clients in New York City. So all of this, it needs to be addressed, but it's also a moving target. So that's the situation we're in.
I mean, there's still go ahead.
Just want to say, this is an important point because you just mentioned Montana. Coincidentally, Susan, Montana actually has a law prohibiting mandatory vaccinations.
Yes, they do.
It's one thing about like the federal mandates. It's another thing about once you get past that, you still have to look at the state law as well.
Absolutely. Yes.
And I'd like to touch upon, Ken, I'll let you go first, but I want to touch upon some of the legal issues involved with Ken.
Yeah, no, I mean, there are plenty of areas or directions we can go on this in terms of right now. I just want to also bring up a point, because some of the people who are on this are nonprofit organizations, and not only are they having to grapple with, their employment related matters, but if they're going to be doing fundraising events and in-person fundraising events, what happens there in terms of policies established for these in-person fundraising events, and what happens if during an event someone gets sick? And, what sort of exposure exists? I don't know if anybody knows the answer to that.
Well, from a fundraising standpoint, the question would be, if somebody gets sick, whether if there's a claim made against the nonprofit or a lawsuit filed, basically for negligence, does their general liability insurance policy cover that claim? And by the way, this is probably an opportunity and for nonprofits to go back to their insurance broker to make sure they have sufficient coverage for that scenario.
Is failure to have people who are attending an event be vaccinated considered negligence?
Maybe. In this day and age, again, you were raising issues that have not gone through the courts and not been resolved. And I could certainly see a plaintiff's attorney making that argument.
Well, then you go ahead, Susan.
I was going to say, as a former attorney, non-practicing at the moment, I often think about what are all the things you're making clear you're putting in place. So for the fundraising event, are you sending a questionnaire? Are you asking if people are vaccinated? Are you requiring people to wear masks? All those things I would think, Doug, add up in looking at liability that you've done at least as much as you can.
Remember, most fundraising events have some level of food attached to them, so it's very difficult for a mask.
It is, but when you're on the Amtrak, which I was just recently, you're allowed to take your mask off while you're in the process of eating. So, there are different things that certainly can be done.
Well, on the converse side, then, if you do mandate someone get a vaccination, and let's say they get sick in the process of getting a vaccination, or maybe they have an adverse effect and unfortunately become disabled or die, what happens there in terms of the risk from an employer perspective?
Well, from the employer side, all right, any claims like that would be covered by workers' comp. Workers' compensation insurance covers any workplace injuries. So if an employee contracts COVID in the workplace because there was not a mandatory vaccination policy, that would be a claim that would be covered by workers' comp. If an employee claims that they suffered, some kind of injury because they were vaccinated, because of a mandatory vaccination policy, that too would be covered by workers' comp. Any employment-related claim that arises out of the employment is covered by workers' comp as the exclusive remedy.
Although, Doug, just to jump in, I think there is some question about whether workers' comp covers contracting COVID.
There's not a question of whether it covers it. There's a question of whether the employee can prove a causal connection between getting COVID in the workplace or getting it from going out and going to the local gas station. I mean, that's been the issue. It's really a causation question. But otherwise it would, if they can prove it, and I don't know how they would necessarily prove it, because everybody goes out and meets other people and comes across other people. The mere fact that you were sitting next to somebody in the office who had COVID, that doesn't mean, and you get COVID, that doesn't mean you got it from that person. So there's a causation issue that makes these workers' comp issues difficult to prove.
You mentioned earlier, the risks concerned with, or why organizations or employers would set up a COVID policy, but what are the legal risks, concerns for establishing a mandated vaccination policy? I mean, is the employer taking on additional risk by mandating this, or no?
There are risks in mandating it. There are risks in not mandating it. So if they're going to have a policy, if they're going to have a mandatory vaccination policy, they just have to recognize that, first of all, it's lawful for an employer to ask if an employee was vaccinated. That's not a medical inquiry under the Americans with Disabilities Act. The EEOC so said that in their regulations that came out in December. But the EEOC also said that if an employee has a valid objection based upon a disability or a valid religious objection, then the employer may have to provide a reasonable accommodation to the employee. So before the employer evaluates the reasonable accommodation issue, they have to engage in the interactive process with the employee, meaning that they have to have a discussion with the employee about the whether there's a disability. What is you can't ask about what the disability is. The employee can object based upon a disability. You can't inquire what the disability is, but if the employer is satisfied that there's a disability, they have to consider a reasonable accommodation. The reasonable accommodation could be permitting the employee to work from home, not come into the office. Could be, as we discussed before, testing the employee on a weekly basis in lieu of requiring the mandatory vaccination. Those are that's the kind of reasonable accommodations that have to be considered by way of example. One of the concerns, by the way, from a legal standpoint, that employers had was that when the vaccinations came out, they were issued by the FDA under the emergency use authorization section of the FDA regulations. And under the FDA regulations, employers were required, or every employee who would be tested would be required to be given a fact sheet from the FDA. And the fact sheet specifically states that the employee can refuse to get the vaccination. So there was some concern from the employment law standpoint that does that FDA regulation somehow trump the employer's entitlement to mandate vaccinations essentially under the EEOC regulations? Well, that question was just answered this week. And again, this is rapid changing news almost on a daily basis. But on July 26th, the United States Justice Department basically stated that notwithstanding that employees are entitled to refuse the vaccination, employers can nevertheless have a mandatory vaccination policy, and that doesn't violate the FDA rules. But interestingly enough, there are other considerations that employers have to take into account now that they receive the green light from the Justice Department regarding this FDA requirement. So employers still have to consider, for example, bargaining obligations if there's a union agreement. The mere fact that the employers are entitled to have a mandatory vaccination program doesn't mean that, that doesn't violate some other agreement like a collective bargaining agreement with the union. As I mentioned before, the Justice Department indicated that the employers continue to have to recognize any accommodation obligations that they may have. Once the mandatory vaccination policy is required by the employer, then the employer still has to determine whether that policy may have a disparate impact on a particular class of people. Hypothetically, if every employee, under 40 received the vaccine and every employee over 40 refused to receive the vaccine, does that policy somehow is that policy somehow discriminatory? An evaluation would have to be made. Again, regarding the discrimination laws, this a mandatory vaccination program, depending on the makeup of the employees, could hamper diversity efforts, at the company. And again, as Susan mentioned before, there are morale issues that and mental health issues that employers have to be aware of and have to consider in having a mandatory vaccination program. So again, these are some of the considerations that the Department of Justice reminded employers that they should take into account before they come out with a mandatory vaccination program.
I think, Doug, also this is more a question for you, really. The question that Ken raised earlier about if you mandate a vaccination and somebody has an adverse impact, what is, or adverse reaction, what is the liability of the company? I mean, where is that being addressed and focused? I know there was an attempt to put things in legislation to protect employers in certain ways, but I don't know that exists at this point. So what is the risk?
It was discussed, but it was never passed, and it's still subject to insurance policies, workers' comp policies, and negligence standards in through the court system.
So it's really an unanswered question, which is it's a question that comes up with a lot of employers right now to do. I think it's one of the main questions that comes up.
Right, and that's got to be considered in their decision-making process.
Yeah, and you could argue both sides. You could argue it's negligent to come out with a mandatory vaccination program. You could argue it's negligence not to. I mean, that's where we are right now.
Doug, you mentioned something which to me sounded a little contradictory, and I apologize. So you turned around and said that from a employer perspective, an employer can set a policy where everybody's required to be vaccinated, and then employees could choose not to be vaccinated if they so choose to. And so we have these two contradicting components here. What rights, legal rights, does an employer have if they've established this policy and now an employee, other than an employee who is under a protected category, what legal rights does the employer have with respect to these employees?
The employer has the legal obligation to consider any request for an accommodation based upon a disability or religious objection. In the absence of that, the employer has a right to mandate the vaccination policy, has a right to terminate the employee if the employee refuses to become vaccinated if there's no accommodation issue. That's the answer.
So what constitutes then a medical condition that would be covered under this? I mean, you've got things like, and we talked about this earlier before we came onto this, but you got things like pregnancy. You've got some younger adults who are afraid with the rDNA shots that could have an impact on, when they are in childbearing years, having children and everything. So how does any of that fit into that whole category of disability, or is that not really considered a disability for purposes of this?
Fair question. And, again, these issues have not been addressed by the courts yet, but, I can tell you that the term disability has been addressed by courts throughout the country. The question is there a disability or not? So, for example, a compromised immune system is probably a disability if it can be shown. Certain allergies would probably be a disability if it could be shown. A pregnancy is probably a disability if it can be shown. But a woman who's merely in a childbearing year, that's not necessarily a disability. Again, then if you have a situation where that employee has received some kind of advice from a doctor, then the employer would have to consider that as to whether it's a disability. I mean, I haven't seen a case where the issue is whether it constituted a disability for purposes of refusing to have a vaccination, mandatory vaccination.
And what about things like medical, mental things like anxiety or things like that? And how do those come into play?
I can tell you that, again, this issue has not been addressed by the courts, but generalized fears are not considered to be a disability under the disability laws. So generalized fear of receiving the vaccination because of something the employee read is just not sufficient to constitute a disability, and it would not require a reasonable accommodation.
So switching gears a little, how are companies verifying that their staff have been vaccinated and or tested? And is there a legal way of doing that?
I mean, companies can ask. They can ask whether you've been vaccinated or not been vaccinated. And there are apps that are being used. There's email questions. There's different ways to gather that depending on the size of the organization. But it can be asked whether you've been vaccinated. You don't want to go too far down that road, other than have you been vaccinated or not. I think another issue that comes up around that is who knows it, who's doing the asking, where is that coming from? So we like to see it come from the HR department and the people with a need to know that information. But there may be situations where a manager or supervisor needs to know about this. So how do you manage that within the company? If you're in a situation where vaccinated people do not need to wear masks, but unvaccinated people do, how does a supervisor police that? How does a supervisor know who has an accommodation, and they therefore will be wearing a mask? And there are a lot of different questions that will come up on the manager supervisor level. So there is a need to push that information out a little bit, but the importance of confidentiality there still remains. It's only as a need to know that anyone else should know about this. Information should be kept in a confidential file, separate with medical information. So all of those issues around keeping confidential medical information, I think, still do apply. But you can ask whether someone has been vaccinated, but we are recommending certainly that it's through the HR department that you manage this.
Yes, as Susan said, vaccine status is confidential medical information. So it's just, who needs to know? The entire office doesn't need to know. HR needs to know. Maybe a supervisor needs to know, but it has to be limited and kept confidential.
It's a difficult situation because you do know where there is a policy of you don't have to wear a mask if you're vaccinated, but if you have an accommodation and you're wearing a mask, people know possibly that there is some sort of a medical information, but you're not giving that information out, and you're not specifically saying what the medical situation is.
Can you grandfather existing staff and require new staff coming on board to be vaccinated? Or can you come up with some sort of modification in terms of how you deal with a vaccination policy so that you mandate it for certain staff and don't mandate it for others?
So I'll jump in first on that. Doug certainly might have some backup on the legal side, but there are companies that are doing that. I believe Delta Airlines announced that they were going to require all new hires. I think United as well, that new hires be vaccinated, and grandfathering existing employees using, with existing employees, trying to use incentives to get people vaccinated, giving additional days off, giving some bonuses. So trying to at least bring in the new cohort of staff as vaccinated and then trying to incentivize the current staff. Again, you're creating two classes of employees that will need to be treated differently, and that's always potential problems in the workplace.
Going back to the question you guys asked answered a couple of minutes ago, and you said, Susan, I think that you can ask an employee if they've been vaccinated, but can you require them to show proof of vaccination, or that's not something you can do?
I believe you can require proof of vaccination. Is that, Doug, is that?
Yes, you can require proof. And as you said, Susan, also that there are now apps and tracking systems. I mean, think about employers with thousands of employees. How is an HR department going to, track, vaccine status? So, this is sort of now a burden on, HR departments to make sure. But the answer is yes, they can require proof. Employers can require proof.
And I know when we were in the throes of COVID, everybody had the forms that they had to be filled out at the front that asked a bunch of questions, and there were temperature checks and everything else. Are you seeing that coming back? Can that still be mandated in a policy by employers? Can they do that just for non-vaccinated people, though that would be hard because then you'd have to share information regarding HIPAA, like in terms of who has and hasn't been vaccinated. So I think you'd have to do that globally for everyone, correct?
Not necessarily, but it has the potential to create a discrimination issue. So it becomes tricky. But getting to your question about whether we can start up with temperature checks and the like, again, employers can really mandate any policy that they think is necessary to protect their staff and their customers. So if that entails temperature checks and social distancing and mask requirements, then employers can continue to mandate that.
Yeah, and I think that goes back to what we said early on. The law around this is not changed. It's the facts, and we're going back to a situation where there is more transmission in communities, and we have to put some of these things back in place.
Do these rules, sorry, I know that I'm kind of going like completely off script on some of this stuff, but there's just so many awesome questions that kind of come out of this. So, we're looking at employees, right? And we've been talking about employees, but a lot of companies and nonprofits use outside contractors. And if I'm utilizing a crew of outside contractors, again, how does that, how can I mandate rules and policies with respect to contractors that might be either coming on site or working for some of my customers? And how does that impact me, Doug, from an employment perspective, if I'm mandating policy?
Well, remember, that by saying the word contractors, you're really talking about a contract. So you could, it would be prudent for the company to actually include in their contract with the independent contract or the contractors or the contracting company that all their employees or anybody who's going to visit the site or work on the site are vaccinated. And now is the time to do it. If they had a contract a year ago that it was unlikely that that language would have been included, but now it would be prudent for employers to just be aware of it. And if that's their requirement, then they should just include it in the contract. And if then the contractor provides people who are not vaccinated, then the company may have the right to terminate the contract.
And again, how would you know if someone, it keeps going back to that same thing? How do you verify? How do you know?
You can ask the contracting company to
provide support and proof.
Yeah, to provide.
And that's not a HIPAA issue.
No, it's not a HIPAA issue.
Okay.
It's not a HIPAA issue to ask whether someone has been, for an employer to ask vaccination status.
Right.
I'm going to throw out a question from the, somebody said, I work in the OPWD field, which is the Office of People with Developmental Disabilities. So we have to send out the mandatory weekly vaccination survey for the staff, contractors, volunteers with proof of vaccination card. HR collects the information, but of course this information is kept confidential. I mean, is that the way it should be done in terms of, like, making sure that we're getting that information on a regular basis? I mean, what's our requirement? Is there something that we should be doing on a regular basis, weekly checks or things like that? Or is it just I check once? Do we know how long? I mean, nobody knows how long these vaccines last anyway, but at what point in time do we need to get stuff renewed?
Yeah, I'm not
how does
sure
all
I
that work?
understand the question. Is the question whether this should be reported on a weekly basis? Is that?
I think the question is that they have a policy where they're looking at things through a weekly vaccination survey of their staff and stuff. And I guess is that sufficient if they're getting, I guess OPWD mandates it. Is it sufficient if they're getting a survey of everybody and everybody's filling out the survey on a regular basis? They don't need to look at anything else. That's it. They've met their requirement.
Yeah, I would think so. But if there are objections based on disability or religious, or religion, then that would be the exception. But if the survey shows that everybody's vaccinated.
And is it an honor system? Are you required to show proof of vaccination on a regular basis?
Well, it sounds like they're required to show proof, right? Is that?
Well, it actually sounded like it was the honor system, but maybe not. But I guess from an employer perspective, again, I think it comes down to, again, I think maybe it does make sense for them to start asking for information to substantiate or support, as opposed to just asking the question or not.
And I think, I'm thinking about how I would advise my client on this. I would want, I think different circumstances require different needs. So if it sounds like in this situation, there's a high level of need to make sure people are vaccinated regularly. So I think that you want to make sure you would want to put in place something more than the honor system. You would want proof. I think that would make sense to do that. I think there isn't a legal reason not to. Something else that I think about when we put a lot of these practices in place also is making sure that you know what you're going to do with that information too. Is somebody regularly looking at it? You don't want that information sitting there without it being handled properly, not only protecting it as confidential information, but knowing what's in there and checking it and acting on it.
I was going to say, wouldn't that, if you are worried about that whole negligence stuff, I mean, if you collected the information and did nothing with it, I think that opens you up to more exposure than if you never asked for the information to begin with.
Yeah.
Right. Yeah, it's one thing to have a policy, it's another to enforce the policy. And by the way, regarding the question that was asked also, you could have certain, you could have agency requirements. For example, the New York State Office of Mental Health may require, certain reporting, may have certain reporting requirements regarding vaccination status. I just don't know. But then if it's an honor system, that may be subject to an audit down the road. So again, I think it's important to just know what those regulations are and just be prepared to be compliant and to prove compliance.
What responsibility do we have to our customers? So again, if I'm an employee that's forward facing or customer facing, and I'm not vaccinated, what responsibility do I have to my customers to let my customer know that all of my staff are not necessarily vaccinated? Do I have any legal responsibility as an employer where I'm kind of interfacing with the outside world or not?
Fair question. I think that first of all, it's sort of a negligence standard. I mean, are you leading your customers to believe that you're that everybody is vaccinated. If you are and they're not, then that may be a misrepresentation or fraud or negligence scenario. On one hand. On the other hand, if a company has a mandatory policy, then they should utilize that policy for marketing purposes with their customers and let their customers know that they're in compliance, that they follow the rules, and that their employees are vaccinated, so that it just shows that it shows the importance to the company of safety and health to both their employees and to their customers.
And I think it was this morning that Apple announced they were going back to requiring masking of everybody going into certain stores as their employees, as well as people entering the stores. So
right.
Again, as we speak, this is all changing, and I think people are looking again at masking. We won't get into the discussion around, is it completely effective? But I think people are going back to that.
Well, just this week, the CDC announced, and they created even more confusion, but they announced that even vaccinated people should wear masks in certain areas. And, it looks like, in the New York area, we're going to be getting there. We're almost there. We're getting there soon if this keeps up. But
just generally, and I know, Ken, I'm sure you have a lot more specific questions, but generally, I think a question for employers is, now you need to think about why you wouldn't have a mandatory vaccination policy. I think rather than thinking, do you want to have it's your choice whether you have it or not. I think you need to give good thought and discussion and analysis to why you would not have a mandatory vaccination policy.
When a potential employee comes in for a job interview, am I allowed to ask that potential employee if they've been vaccinated, and can I use that in my decision-making process as to whether or not to hire them?
The answer is yes. It's not deemed to be a medical inquiry for purposes of the disability discrimination laws, and you can ask, and you can refuse to hire somebody if they're not, if that's your policy.
Right. Yeah, I agree with that. And I think it's also important why you need to have a policy. So it doesn't seem arbitrary. You have a policy around it.
I mean, there's a bunch of other questions, and I've kind of been trying to incorporate some of those into my questions as I've got along. When we were talking about disabilities and stuff, and I think, Doug, you mentioned something about a doctor's note. So how detailed does that doctor's note have to be? What information needs to be in that doctor's note to cover an employer? What happens if the doctor's note says, I excuse Johnny from needing a vaccination, and that's it?
It's probably not enough, and the employer is entitled to determine whether there's a disability. The mere fact that there's a doctor's note doesn't mean that the employee is entitled to an accommodation from the mandatory vaccination policy due to a disability. So the employer is entitled to inquire about whether there's a disability. And then if they determine that there's a disability, then they'd have to engage in the interactive process to determine whether there's a reasonable accommodation to be granted. But a doctor's note enough, excusing the employee from having to receive the vaccine is not enough.
And wouldn't there be some consideration about the burden on the organization to do the accommodation, which I know is, can be tricky to argue, but that, as well as whether the accommodation poses a risk to others in your workplace.
Right. So that's part of the analysis when you engage in the determination of whether an accommodation should be granted, whether there's an undue burden on the employer and and whether that creates a hardship. So that's part of the analysis. But typically, depending on the employee's duties, if it's administrative in nature, you wouldn't think that working from home would be, an issue as an accommodation. But if you have a elevator mechanic, obviously an elevator mechanic can't work from home. So, you'd have to determine, those considerations as well.
Is there anything else you guys want to share? We're kind of running low on time here. We're almost up to an hour. Anything else you want to share before we cut this off?
Just one sentence on working from home. So if an accommodation is granted and employers are permitting their employees to work from home, I've talked about this issue. They have to remember that the home office is deemed to be the workplace for wage and hour purposes, for workers' comp purposes. And if an employee trips on the way to the bathroom at their home office, that could be covered by workers' comp. They have to make sure they have all their insurances in place to protect them from any workplace negligence issue. They have to make sure that their IT is up to snuff so that their trade secrets and confidential information are protected if the employee is working from their home computer. So again, there's a heightened sensitivity that employers should have when they do look at the request for an accommodation, which includes working from home.
Does that include the need for on insurance policies to list the address of each employee on the insurance policy as an additional address, or no?
Maybe, but that should be coordinated with your insurance broker.
Okay. Susan, anything else you want to add?
I think I would just leave people with the importance of having policies, as difficult as it is to make decisions around these issues. And I think a lot of our conversations today shows that there's so many things up in the air. It's important to have policies, be flexible with those policies, and also think about having some sort of a task force that focuses on watching what's happening outside your company, watching what's happening inside to make decisions quickly. I found that's a helpful practice.
And to help you from a negligence perspective, I'm assuming that task force, any discussions that happen at the task force should be documented to show that you're proactive in your approach?
Absolutely. That's always document what you're doing. But I think it's also important just to make decisions and be able to be flexible with the decisions in a group with people who understand the issues and know what's going on.
I really, really want to appreciate you sharing all your expertise with us today. This was totally amazing on such a difficult topic. Again, if people want to ask additional questions, I will provide the contact information for both Susan and Doug. Thank you, everyone, for tuning in today for this insightful discussion. We're going to be back again on August 25th when our guest will be Fenton Joseph from Olive Branch Digital. He'll be discussing making your website compliant and other website recommendations to limit your company's risk. Until then, I guess stay safe, and we'll see you guys next month. So thank you, everyone.
Thank you.
Thanks, Jen.